Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
A West Cumbrian coal mine. John Bragg was a coal miner. He was a friend of my grandfather, William Fell. In the early 1960s, they worked at various pits around the West Cumberland coalfield, moving from one to another as they were closed down. There was a particular pit that he worked at near a village called Siddick on the coast. They've landscaped the area now, and there's no trace that there was ever a mine there. Miners are traditionally superstitious men. Their lives hang on a thread when they're underground. There are so many ways they can die. By earth as the rock collapses on them. By fire as a spark from their picks ignites the invisible fire-damp gas. By water as a sea breaks in and floods the galleries that run miles out under the sea. And finally by air as the dreadful sucking gas known as choke damp steals all their oxygen. Some men would refrain from washing their whole back as they sat in the tin baths in front of the fire when they came home from work. They said that if your whole back got washed, that was inviting it to get broken, as if the bathwater would wash its strength away so you couldn't withstand the falling rock. They were all superstitious, but John Bragg had a reputation for being the worst. He always took a scrap of blue silk with him when he went down the pit. It had belonged to his fiancée, Dorothy. They were due to get married, but the Asian flu took Dorothy. That was years ago, but he wanted no one else. The men he worked with were hard men, and they didn't tolerate weakness in others, but they never mocked John for his bit of silk. They knew how her death had affected him, and they knew that even beyond the grave, he still loved her. There was one gallery deep down in the mine that had a reputation for being haunted, the Ladies' Gallery. I suppose that during it being worked, men must have died down there, but oddly, the reports of the ghosts, such as they were, never referred to men. It wasn't dead miners that haunted the gallery, but something different, something that shouldn't ever be down a mine at all. People used to avoid going down there unless they had a specific job. It was off the main thoroughfare, the long tunnel that they took on their way to the coalface way out under the sea. Even though it was out of the way, the Ladies' Gallery was a handy place to store things like wheels for the bogies that transported the coal, or bricks for building walls, or any of the structures that they might need underground, and general odds and ends that kept the mine ticking over. My granddad said that what scared the people who went to the Ladies' Gallery was the odd noises. They said that the worst was the sound of rustling silk, as if someone was rubbing the material between their fingers, always behind you and always in the dark. As if it was standing there in the shadows just outside where the light reached, as if it was watching you. Most of the time, the thing in the Ladies' Gallery was forgotten about. There was a job to do, the coal had to be hewn, and the sea kept out. However, there was an upsurge of interest in the story after one miner reported hearing it when he went down to the Ladies' Gallery. This man had a reputation as a bit of a clown, and so no one took the story seriously. They thought it was just him trying to get some attention. No one took it seriously, that is, apart from John Bragg. The story of the Ladies' Gallery seemed to obsess him. People didn't like to ask him why he was always talking about the story, because he seemed so eager and strange about it. One time my grandfather did ask him. He felt he knew him well enough to pull his leg about his fixation on the place. After all, they'd been boys together. But when William Fell asked him why he seemed able to think of nothing else, John Bragg just smiled a strange smile and said, "I know who it is." "Who what is?" said William. "Who it is that rustles the silk?" My grandfather half guessed, but asked anyway, "And who is it?" John pulled a scrap of blue silk from his pocket where he always kept it and rubbed it between his fingers. "It's her, it's my Dorothy." William thought he was half mad and changed the subject. Then the next day, John tried to persuade him to go to the Ladies' Gallery when they'd finished their shift. William said, "When I'm finished in the pit, I'm going home. I spend too many hours in the dark as it is." John tried to persuade him, "If we just waited there, I'm sure we'd hear it. If we missed the end of our shift, we might have to wait a long time for the cage to come back below. I'd hate them to forget about us down here." He tried to force some humour, despite how uneasy he felt at seeing John's frantic, eager eyes. John said, "But she's come here for me. I can't ignore her." "Ignore who?" said my grandfather, exasperated. Dorothy, she's come here to talk to me. My grandfather looked at him in silence. Could John really believe that his dead bride had returned from the grave to meet him in the inky blackness of a coal mine, away from the bustle of the work, in a place so silent itself that the only sounds were men working miles away, or the dripping of water from the roof? You can't be serious, he said finally. John nodded. I know in my heart, Bill. She comes and whispers to me at night. She tells me to come and meet her down there. And then he looked embarrassed, as if he'd just disclosed a terrible personal secret. All his hope was in his eyes, the hope of a man that death had cheated of love. William felt sorry for him. He wanted to help him, but he knew that this was insane. Later, he said that the most unnerving thing about it was that John was so serious he truly believed that some dead woman was calling to meet her in that place without light, deep underground. William shook his head. I'm sorry, John, but I won't do it. It's not good for you to dwell on this. 2 weeks passed, and then it so happened that William's son was ill. John Bragg should have been off work that day, but he volunteered to do an extra shift to cover William so that William could take his son for medical treatment. William knew he owed John a favour after that, but he was wary about what he would ask him to do. At first, John asked him nothing. Then, in a few days, when they were getting ready to go underground, John said, I still want to go to the ladies' gallery. Will you come? William felt like saying that if John was so sure that it was Dorothy, why didn't he go on his own? But he couldn't leave the poor sick man to do that. He knew he should go with him to make sure he was all right and to bring him back up to the light when it was proved that this was just his imagination, that Dorothy was dead, like everyone else who passed away. For if William knew anything, it was that the dead do not return. John asked again, Please, Bill, it would mean a lot to me, he continued quietly, and you do owe me a favour. William sighed and turned his back to his gear, making sure everything was working and safe. But John persisted. Will you come with me tomorrow, Bill, after we finish? William felt he had no alternative. I will, he said, but I can't see any good coming of it. When William went back home that night and told his wife that he would be late the next day and why, she told him that John Bragg was a fool and that he was a bigger fool for agreeing to go with him. She said, I know it's sad that Dorothy died, but it's not healthy that he dwells on it, and you shouldn't be encouraging him by going there with him. William groaned. I owe him a favour. He swapped shifts with me, she said. Your sense of honour will get you into trouble one day, William fell. So they went to work the next day, William and John and all the other miners. People commented on it as he worked. You'd think he'd won the derby, said one. Either that or he's got a woman lined up, said another. William kept quiet. He knew why John was so happy. He thought he was going to meet his dead love. At the end of the long shift, they hung back as the rest of the men made their way along the tunnels, walking the 3 miles back to the elevators that would take them to the surface. William had a strong sense of foreboding. They walked down the tunnel. It was so low in some places that they had to stoop to avoid banging their heads. In this tunnel, there was a long electric cable tacked on the ceiling from which dangled electric light bulbs. The rooms that lay off the main tunnel, such as the ladies' gallery, were not lit. The only light in those rooms came when the miners entered and shone the battery-powered headlamps that they fastened to their hard hats. And the batteries only had a limited life, enough to last through a shift and then a bit more. That was another reason that William was not keen to linger too long in the ladies' gallery. He feared his light would die, and then they would be in the impossible dark, a blackness so complete it was as if someone had snuffed the world out. They were a long way behind the others now, and as they got closer to the ladies' gallery, even John became quiet, as if his excitement had turned to apprehension. And finally they stopped by the dark entrance to the man-made cave. Here, said John. Aye, said William. Here. William saw his lamp flick. We need to be mindful of the life left in these batteries, he said. We can't be here too long. John turned to William as if nervous and said, You have to wait with me, Bill. You've promised. They entered the ladies' gallery and William sat himself down on a box that lay in the middle of the cavern. John just stood there. What now? Said William. John shrugged. Maybe we should switch off the lights. Maybe that'll encourage her. She always was shy. Do you have any other form of light? Asked William. John shook his head. William grunted. Luckily, I brought a candle and some matches. They're in my pack. William started to search in his pack while John sat on a big coil of rope. He looked expectantly into the dark tunnels that led off the gallery. William got out his candle and his matches and set them to the side. He also had a flask of water which he sipped from and then handed to John. John smiled and took it. Handing it back, he said, "She will come, you know. She loves me. She told me last night." William regarded him with a sense of pity, but also fear, because the man was clearly mad. And then, what if she, Dorothy, a revenant, did come? He tried to distract himself. Beside the candles, he placed an old-fashioned pocket watch. Old-fashioned, but it still told the time well. William gave their enterprise 1 hour, and then he was going for the cage. He felt a weariness in his muscles after his hard physical labour, and although his box was not a bed, and it was far from comfortable, as the silent minutes counted themselves round the watch face, he found his concentration fading, and his head drooping, and his eyes closing. Then he heard it. Something fluttering out of sight in the dark tunnel. William snapped awake. What was that? But he knew. It was the sound of rubbing silk. He span round to check John was still there. John was standing up, a look of pure joy on his face. "It's her. I knew she'd come." "Did you make that noise?" asked William. "No, Bill, I told you, it's Dorothy." William looked around him. The light in his headlamp battery was fading, and it hardly illuminated the gallery at all. There was silence. Then he heard it again. The sound was coming just out of the light from one of the darker tunnels that lay beyond the ladies' gallery. William stood up. He shouted, "Is there anyone there? Show yourself. Give up with your silly games." There was no reply. John was smiling. "I just wanted to show herself." "Come on, Dorothy, it's me, John. Don't be shy." William noticed that John's light too was faint. "I'm going to light the candle," he said. He scrabbled with the match because his hands were shaking so much, but then he succeeded and the flickering yellow flame caught and grew. "Come on, John, let's go. This is just someone playing a trick." "No, Bill, it's Dorothy." And John called again into the darkness, calling for his shy love to show her face. William put his hand on John's shoulder. "John," he said, "I'm as brave as any man, but this is getting the better of me. Let's make our way back to the main tunnel and then to the cage." John shook his hand off. The sound of rustling silk came again. This time it was distinct. It was coming from the darkness in the tunnel that led away from the main workings of the mine. "See, she's there," said John. He was pointing down the tunnel. "I saw a shape. Something moved." "Your eyes are tricking you, or it's someone playing a joke on us." But William knew none of his mates would have had the patience to wait for so long in a pitch-black tunnel. It was a lot more sinister than a joke. "No, she's down there," said John. "Maybe she's too shy to come out and see me with you here. I'm not leaving you on your own." "It'll be all right, Bill. It's Dorothy. She loves me." William felt fear rise in him, and he struggled to keep it down. Then John's helmet lamp flickered and died. The diminution of the light brought the shadows crowding in on them. The darkness danced and moved as a single candle flame quavered in the faint drafts. "What if it's not Dorothy, John? What if it's something else?" said William. John shook his head. "Of course it's Dorothy. Who else could it be? The silk is the sign. It's her sign that she's coming for me." Then William's headlight died as well, and all it left them with was the light of the candle. He had some matches to relight it if the draft blew out, but not many. The darkness came very close, and as if with that weakening of light, the sound came again, this time more insistent, closer, and louder. Whereas before it had come and then was quiet, this time it was a frantic rustling. It no longer sounded like a woman's dress, but like something quite different, something wicked and old. William took John's arm. "Come on, I don't mind admitting that this is unnerving me. Let's go now." John shook himself free, angry now, annoyed at William's attempt to keep him from meeting this dead thing that stood just out of sight in the annihilating blackness of the tunnel. Without warning, he turned and ran into the dark, down into the tunnel where the sound was, where whatever it was waiting for him. And even William's courage failed. He could barely stay where he was. Every nerve urged him to turn and run. But he couldn't leave John in the dark. He shouted down the tunnel. He shouted for John to come back, but his voice echoed unanswered down the black and vacant tunnels that stretched down into the centre of the earth, perhaps all the way to hell itself. "John, where are you? The candle's nearly gone," he yelled, but there was no reply. He looked at the stump of the candle in its pool of wax. He had maybe 10 minutes left. The watch told him they'd been there nearly 2 hours. He couldn't afford to stay much longer, or he'd be lost there in the dark himself, and with no light, it would be free to come when it wanted. William shouted again for John, and this time he thought he heard something. He listened hard and shouted and listened again, and then he knew he had heard it, just behind him. Not in the tunnel where it was before, but standing behind him in a direction that cut him off from the way out to the cage. There was no doubt it was the rustling of silk. William picked up his pickaxe and he shouldered his bag. When it was secure on his shoulder, he took the candle with its fluttering flame, hoping that the breeze wouldn't extinguish it as he walked. He brandished the pick like a weapon. "Whatever you are," he said, "you'll not take me." He walked slowly, fearing that at any time it would reach out of the surrounding dark. But he walked out of the ladies' gallery, and if the thing was there, it let him leave. As he got to the main tunnel, the candle flame guttered and died. But ahead, only yards, the electric light still burned. He could see the way ahead to the cage, and he ran towards it. When he got there, panting and out of breath, he heard the machinery working as the cage descended. When he got to the bottom, he saw that there were 2 electricians in it. One of them was Jack Tubman, a man nearing retirement who'd worked down the mine for 45 years. "Thank God," said William. "John Bragg's gone missing near the ladies' gallery." "The ladies' gallery," said Tubman, "and what possessed you to go there of all places?" William told the story, and Jack and his mate listened. A knowing look passed between them. "You go up now, Bill. We'll speak to the foreman and go looking for him." The mine managers organised an extensive search, but it did not find any sign of John. After searching as many of the miles of tunnels as they could, eventually they called the search off. And then, 4 days after he disappeared, they found John's body in the middle of the ladies' gallery, as if something had put it there. Jack Tubman came round to tell William personally. William's wife offered him tea in the small terraced house, and as he sipped it, William asked him, "What did he die of?" Jack shook his head. "No one knows. He was stone dead, but without a mark on his body." William saw his hand was shaking. He said, "Fear, then?" Jack shrugged. "I don't know." William said the poor fool thought it was his dead fiancée. Jack shook his head. "I doubt that," he said firmly. "Then what was it, if not her?" "No one knows what it is. But that thing's always been there, ever since they first sank the shaft. Whether it came down with us from above, or more likely it was there waiting for us, I don't know. But one thing's for sure. Whatever he met down there, it wasn't Dorothy."
Everybody dies, don't they?
So that was a West Cumberland coal mine, which is a staple, or was a staple, of our Erie Cumbria live ghost story reading tour. And it was one of those stories in my book, Cumbrian Ghost Stories, which you can still buy if you're so inclined. Now, I'll tell you something about the history of the story. So, I remember reading something like this in the West Cumberland Times and Star in the 1970s, and it may even be this story that is responsible for my lifelong interest in ghost stories. It was supposed to be a true story as well. Now, for many centuries, coal was mined near where I live, where I'm from, and that kind of finished in the 1970s. And the coal mines have all been shut for a long time. After the deep mines shut, they used to open cast, so they would just strip off the topsoil of vast areas. And to be fair to them, they actually returned the land so that it was in a better condition, because it was usually better drained, because a lot of the land was rough moor, bog land, you know. And when they returned it, I'm not sticking up for open cast mining, I'm just pointing out that the land now, when you look where they were, often looks better than the adjoining land. Anyway, that is a digression. My grandfather was a coal miner, and my great-grandfather and my great-great-grandfather. Now, the interesting thing about that was, in those days, they were from, well, you know, everybody goes back further and further and further, but for a few hundred years, certainly my grandmother's family, who were the coal miners, had shops as well, and one of them had a farm, and so they kind of supplemented the mining income by doing a bit of grocery, I think, as well. My actually granddad, who was Anthony Fell, after whom I'm named, he was a wonderful man. He was really the shining star in my life, and he died when I was 13. His lungs were ruined, you see. Not only did he breathe a lot of coal dust in, but he smoked heavily as well. And he asked me never to smoke, and I never have because of that. And that was a long time ago now. Been dead a long time. I kind of made it as if he told me the story, and in fact, he didn't, although he was a miner. In those mines, in fact, it was supposed to be a mine at a place called Siddick, which is the old name, Sea Dyke, because it's right by the sea. And that settlement was founded by the monks in the something like the 12th, 13th century as a dike against the sea, a defense against the sea. And they improved a lot of land there. But anyway, they also mined coal. So the coal has been mined for a long time. My grandfather his family were slaters. They were roofers. They used to put slates on the roof. And in fact, there's a church near here which my great-grandfather put the slates on. He became a miner because there was more money in it. And he was, by trade, he trained as a bricklayer, and then he used to build structures underground. You would be amazed that they do need everything underground. And so he used to build structures and buildings underground. But there was more money at the coalface, even though it was more dangerous and more unpleasant work. So he did. Now, the interesting thing about the coalfields here is that they go out under the sea, in some cases for miles, 2-3 miles, and the coal is very faulted. So there were lots of disasters whereby the sea broke in and drowned them all. So if they didn't blow up from the damp, what do they call it? Not the choke damp just suffocated them. The fire damp blew up, and then there was always the danger of the sea coming in and drowning them all. So it was not I don't think they were paid very much either, so it wasn't much of a job. Funnily enough, as I'm digressing, my uncle, my granddad wouldn't let him go down the pits, and he became a teacher. So there we are. Yeah, it's sort of like in all stories, you take fragments of the truth or fragments of stories you've heard and you weave them together. So yes, my grandfather was a miner. Yes, he was in those mines. Yes, there was supposed to be a story about this silken rustling down in the depths, in the dark depths. But I put them all together quite a while ago, and then I kind of refashioned it. And it goes down well at live readings because you have that da, 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 and at the end, aye lad, but, you know, and then they reveal the terrible truth that is something monstrous that has been disturbed. And I guess that idea is probably something to Tolkien's Balrog, because if you remember in The Lord of the Rings and all the mythos, the Tolkien mythos, the dwarves dug too deep and awoken some ancient evil, which we later find out was one of the Balrogs of Morgoth from the first stage. But let's not get too nerdy about our Tolkien here. I was a big Tolkien nerd back in the day. And and I guess the metaphor there is that it's greed, isn't it? The Balrog is a punishment for the dwarves' greed. And I wonder in this story whether you could read that as a punishment of nature's punishment for men for going to rob the earth. I don't know. Sometimes it's very interesting when you put these up and then people comment on them. And people come up with things you never thought of yourself. They also see plot holes that you'd overlooked. So what you get is somebody saying, but why didn't you do that? And you go, because I didn't think of it. But anyway, it's all imperfect. And as I say about everything, You can only do what you can do. You can only produce the work that you're inspired to produce with the gifts and talents that you have. And that's true for everybody. And you can't, I can't be Elon Musk. I don't think he writes ghost stories. Or Vladimir Putin, or let's find a more inspiring one, Mahatma Gandhi, or, you can only be who you are. So there we are. So what is the story about? It was just a kind of story with a nice spooky feel to it. And if you wanted to read a message into it, it might be about punishment. But what is she doing? What kind of thing is she? Well, she's not a ghost. She takes on, actually, I just thought about this. If you listen to my other story, The Catacombs, which is about a young girl in Paris, in the Paris catacombs, where there is a thing lurking down there as well. So if we wanted to be all psychological, this could be something lurking deep in my unconscious. I also noticed another thing, that a lot of my stories involve the unfortunate protagonist being eaten. I've got stories about cannibalism, I'm sorry to tell you. So this leads me to another point. There's been a debate about what I should write about, whose stories I should read, and should I censor some people. Now, you'll know if you listen to the podcast particularly that I have kind of agonized debates about this sometimes. But I think we've got to take the creators of these works as they were in their context, and they aren't us. And if we read an ancient Greek play or an ancient Indian play or listen to an Australian Aboriginal story, there are going to be cultural differences, and we are not them. And so some of the things that people would do in other cultures and other places and other times, we wouldn't do, and vice versa. I've said this about the Victorians. You turn on our TV and you will see often quite graphic sexual scenes that the Victorians would have died. That they would have absolutely died. They just couldn't have done stuff like that. Whereas things that they do, their casual misogyny and racism and classism, that they took for granted, that the gentleman was just infinitely superior to the labourer. It wasn't up for debate, and that was in the stories they produced. So I'm not going to censor the stories, I don't think. I'm going to read the stories and you can judge them for what they are. They're not necessarily my views, because I am a creature of my own time, such as you are as well. But so that's that. As for trigger warnings, I thought about that as well. So, what can we say? Man gets eaten. Warning. If cannibalism offends, do not listen to this story. Man gets eaten at the end. It kind of gives the twist away. Man gets huge moth eggs laid in him. And going back to the Dirtwater haunting, really, I did not kill that dog. I did not kill the dog. The dog actually never existed. And I don't think it was gratuitous either. The poor thing was found and the guy was heartbroken about it. I am kind of rambling on theme. I am having a stream of consciousness thing going on here, but it is on theme. Anyway, this is all relatively unrelated to a West Cumberland coal mine, which I said was a staple. We're probably going to be doing them again this autumn if we're out of lockdown. We will do some more live storytelling events. I'm supposed to be doing one on the 8th of July, which is, I can't do ghost stories. I'm doing summer. It's called Midsummer Madness. And I'm doing excerpts from Wind and Willows and I've forgotten. I better remember before the night, haven't I? A Wind in the Willows, John Macefield's Midnight Folk, which I love. I love Wind and Willows. And the tea party scene from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. And we're going to round it out by a few quotes from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. So hopefully that'll be okay. Now, I'm also busy writing more for a second volume of those stories. So I'm about to write, if I get time tonight, I'm going to write one called Bella Sheephead, which is an actual local legend. I didn't make it up, about I don't want to give this away, a sheep-headed monster that lives in the lonely country roads around here. This is a trigger warning. If you're offended by the idea of sheep eating people, don't listen to that story. Anyway, I'm sure we'll speak again. Dubmill Point. I'm a painter, not a painter and decorator. I don't do houses, though I can, albeit in an amateurish way. No, I do art. I'm an artist. No, I don't think that makes me better than you. In fact, I probably don't earn as much as you, nor even the milkman, but it keeps me going. It's my ikigai, sense of purpose, and raison d'être. I was on a break looking for inspiration, so I'd come to the remote northwest corner of England and the wide, empty coast, where Scotland was almost close enough to kiss over the water when the mist wasn't down, or it wasn't raining, and the Isle of Man sat like a peaked boat to the south, but Ireland was invisible over the horizon. I'd taken a cottage, a small place rented out by a company on the internet. It had fishing nets on the walls, model yachts and curtains, bizarrely covered by the names of ports in Cornwall, seaside style. It was autumn, September and misty, but not cold. My cottage was in the village of Allenby, and each day I'd go out walking on the beach, looking for scenes to paint, to fix in my memory for later. It was a time of the full moon, and because of that, the tides were huge. They pulled in and out, and when they flooded in, they threatened the narrow coast road and dressed it in sand, seaweed and crab shells, and when they drained out, they exposed miles of flat, red sand dotted with rocks which were draped with black mussel shells, and on the sand, jellyfish dropped here and there like fallen stars, and at the distant line of waves, seabirds strutting and feeding in the mud. I could walk for miles and not see anyone. Maybe sometimes I'd glimpse dog walkers far away throwing frisbees for their pooches, but that was the extent of the company I had on that lonely beach, until the third day, when I saw him. I had wandered north up to Dubmill Point, at the end of the bay where the curve of the land sweeps out again, and on this point is a sombre-looking farmhouse that's probably been there for 400 years, and every time I saw it, the windows were shuttered. I guess that was so the waves didn't hurl rocks through the glass on wild nights. And it seemed that the owner of the farm wasn't just a farmer with his few sheep and few cows, but he was a fisherman too. I know because I saw him out there with his nets. That day, I was way out by the edge of the waves, about a mile from shore, and between me and the grassy dunes lay acres of flat sand dimpled by the wind, sculpted by wave and runneled by tiny rivulets of water that drained the necklace of rock pools, homes of crabs and shrimps and anemones. Gulls hung halfway between sea and heaven. The sun glimmered, filtered white by cloud, pale and ghost-like, but still bright enough to throw a sparkle on the water. I'd measured the scene in my mind, thinking of canvases and paints and brushes. I'd do it in colour wash, I thought, Turneresque, something diaphanous. I had taken off my shoes and walked on the cool sand, leaving prints behind like a marooned sailor adrift from the dryland world. I didn't notice him at first. He was calf-deep with poles and nets that stretched about 20 feet, strung out like the briny sand was a tennis court. He stood, dressed in black Wellington boots, black trousers, a black coat, and black hair gone grey plastered across his forehead, and he stared at me. It was hard to read the stare. It certainly wasn't welcoming. Surprised? Hostile? Astonished? I couldn't say. Given there was only him and me for miles and no help coming out here on the empty sands, I decided to disarm any aggression with a cheery greeting. "Hello," I yelled, but the words fell flat, and the waves lapped around my feet, and he said not a word, but only stared. I made my smile even more prominent. "Hello," I said, and waved. I thought if he didn't answer, I wouldn't push it. Instead, I would veer towards the land as if I had intended to walk that way anyway, rather than along the wave's edge, which had been my real route. The fisherman just looked, then nodded. Slowly, He lifted a hand in acknowledgement. I was about 30 yards from him now. "Not a bad day," I yelled across the distance, coming closer with every step. He watched me like he knew me. That was odd. Then he put his hand to his throat in a movement that betrayed anxiety. Him, anxious of me, and me a stranger and a woman past the flower of her youth, not in much of a state to run or fight, even if I had to. Odder. "Fishing?" I said, stating the obvious. He licked his lips as if to moisten them. Then he said, I laughed. "I'm a visitor, just out for a walk." "Of course," he said. "I see that now." "Did you mistake me for someone else?" He looked out to sea, then back, composed. He looked out to sea, then back, now composed. His hand went to his net. "Not much today. It depends on the time of year. Sometimes we get cod, plaice, dabs, you know." He shrugged. "Salmon too. But we have to release those now. Government, you know." "I've not seen nets like this. What do? String them out?" "They call them half nets. They go back to the Vikings. There used to be gangs of us who did it. There's only me here now." "I'm Vicky Bond," I said abruptly. "George Twentyman I am, from Dubmill." He gestured behind him to the dark farmhouse. "The farmer?" "I don't have much stock now. Can't manage it on my own. The wife's dead." "I'm sorry." "The lad's away at agricultural college at Penrith." "Do you get lonely?" I asked. He shook his head. There were crabs and seaweed and a few small fish twined through his net. The fish gleamed in the pale sunlight. The crabs flexed their dying claws. "So, you thought you recognized me?" I said. Some strange expression seized his face. He glanced down at the wet sand around his black boots, then looked to sea again. "On holiday?" he said. "I'm a painter." "Ah, painter," he said, like he didn't know what I was talking about. "Dressed in black?" I shrugged, self-conscious. Dressing in black was a habit I'd got into during my days following the cure. My husband always said I should brighten up my image, but I kept it as a pose. I was an arty type, you see. "Don't worry, it doesn't mean funerals," I joked. "Doesn't it?" he said. Then a silence fell between us. I paused, working up my courage, then said, "Listen, would you mind awfully if I came back another time and did some sketches?" "Sketches?" "Of you. It's a great image. You out here all alone with your nets on this vast open beach, and because it's a dying tradition, it gives it resonance." "You want to paint me?" I nodded. For the first time he laughed. "Really? Me?" "Yes, please." And as I said the words, I became more convinced that was what I was meant to do, what I'd been brought here for. "I didn't think I'll make much of a painting." "On the contrary, I think you'll be perfect." He smiled, perhaps flattered. "Will you come to the farm to do it?" I shook my head. "No, out here's best. It's so open. I'll come back with a sketch pad and a camera, if you don't mind." "Out here then," he said. And as he said it, an unfathomable look came into his eyes, as if he sensed the play of fate, and in my overblown artistic way, I imagined us surrendering to powers beyond my knowledge. The next day, I went looking. Foolishly, I hadn't made a time with him. I just thought I'd see him there as if he were a fixture on the beach. The weather was worse today, and this time I took my Wellingtons and raincoat. The rain was spotting, a mizzle more than a downpour, and even that cleared with the clouds moving. Scotland was invisible, just lines of waves retreating flat and far away. I had a camera and a sketchbook and some charcoal pencils. The scene suited black and white, a chiaroscuro in vapour. And he was there. With his nets he stood, gazing across the sands as if he expected someone. This time he saw me and waved from afar, but when I got close, despite the faint smile in his salt-tanned face, he looked haunted. That was the word. It popped into my mind, and it was the correct one. "So, you're going to draw me," he said. I tapped my camera. "I'll take a few photos, then do some sketches, just to capture the mood and the lines. All right if I call you George?" Aye, lass, what else would you call me? Mr. Twentyman? I shrugged. If you prefer. Nay, lass, George is fine. He frowned. Which way did you come? I indicated vaguely with a stretched arm. I wasn't concentrating on where I'd come from. I was planning images and pictures that would capture the man and this empty, waterlogged world that was his, and it seemed, his alone. You've got to be careful at the channels, he said. They fill up behind you. You can be out on the sand like this, and when you turn to walk in, the seas come in, and you're cut off. I nodded. I had a mirrorless camera, a Canon M50 Mark II, smaller and lighter than a DSLR, but still good quality. I checked the light, took a few snaps. I'll bear that in mind, I said. It's just, you don't know the shore, the channels and the banks and the rocks. The rocks all have names. He pointed to a big lump of granite sitting in a pool of water, draped in seaweed like a bad haircut, a gull perched on it. That's Inginstian, the hanging stone. I navigate my way by them, but you don't know them. Have you ever got lost out here, I asked. Sometimes you can lose your sense of direction when the sea mist comes in. It sounds treacherous. It can be. But like I say, I know the shore. I grinned. I'll stick with you then. He stood awkwardly. What do you want me to do? Maybe fix the nets? Fix them? They're in good repair though. Then, I don't know, examine them? He shrugged and went stiffly to look at the nets. He was not a natural model. I took my photographs, placed my rucksack on the sand, got out the small sketchbook and began drawing him in lines and strokes. We'd been there maybe 20 minutes. I'd lost count of time when he jerked his head round and started back. He was staring seaward, where the tide had gone even further out, revealing flat, shining expanses of sand before the retreating waves. What? I said. He jerked his head around. Can you see her? Who? He levelled his arm and pointed. I saw his arm. I saw his hand trembling. I followed his finger but saw only waves and wading birds picking at the water's edge. I can't see anyone. He shook his head. Just I thought I saw her. Who? The woman. I narrowed my eyes and looked again. There was nobody there. It started to rain, and the warbling sound of a curlew rose eerily from the water's edge. I'd better be getting back, he blurted. Oh, okay, just, can you draw me another day? I just need to get back to milk the cows. He'd already told me that he had hardly any cows anymore, but he'd stepped back away, leaving the net to stand in place and catch the next tide. He paused. He was definitely spooked by something, staring out to the turning tide line. That's fine, of course. Come back with me if you like, to the house. I'll tell you there. And then he strode off, and I hurried after him. After about 500 yards, we came to a deep channel that was already filling with water. It's turned, he said, indicating the swirling brown seawater. You can wade through this, but if it gets deeper, the water was just below the tops of my Wellington boots, but if we'd delayed, I would have got wet feet. That was probably why he'd decided to come back. He'd remembered the incoming tide. When we arrived at his lonely farmhouse, he made me a cup of tea, cows forgotten about. The house was not comfortable. I could smell the damp in the walls. The shutters were open, but the light outside was poor, and the light inside not much better. There was a fire laid ready in the ancient hearth, piled sticks of kindling wood, surrounded by coals and crowned with twirls of newspaper that he'd rolled and twisted to serve as firelighters. He put a match to it, and when the kettle whistled from the kitchen, went through and brought me a mug and the tin kettle with the flame-blackened bottom. He made the tea for me by spooning tea leaves with a tarnished silver dessert spoon into the mug and adding boiling water straight. Then he spilled a dash of milk from a glass bottle, maybe milked from his own cows. No tea bags or teapot for Mr. Twentyman. The tea was strong and curled my tongue. He offered me a ginger snap from a packet, the plastic wrapper torn away at the top end. I took one, and he urged me to take another. So I did. Who do you think you saw? I said, sitting there as the room warmed with the fire. He went quiet and stared at the curling flames, then took a sip of tea. I first saw her when I was a lad. It was a low tide like this one. It was Easter. I was out with my father and grandfather. They knew pools where the lobsters were, and when the tide went out that far, you could find them. We were busy getting the lobsters and tying their claws so they didn't kill each other when I saw her out in the water. The tide was up to her middle. I thought she must be in trouble, so I ran into the waves. He rubbed his mouth. Grandad and Fadder were busy and didn't see me at first. I was halfway to her when I saw her face. She was dressed in black and the clothes hung on her wet through. She had long black hair, but her face was like it had been in the water a long time, perished and withered and wet, with empty eye holes where the fishes had been at them. I screamed. I fainted. My father brought me back. Grandad was quiet. They never asked what I'd seen. He lifted his eyes to mine. Never Jans in aught ears efter. I told my mum. It was in this room. He indicated around him. I remember it like it was yesterday. She said it was a drowned woman. She'd always been there, but not every Jan could see her. My mother's family were from Marlborough. She'd never seen her, but my father's family were from here. And they did. It sounds horrible, nightmarish. I didn't know whether I believed in this drowned woman, but he certainly did. Even in his own front room with a cup of tea and the fire going, his face grew grey. You see, he said, she comes as a warning. A warning? Aye, when I see her, I know someone is going to die. They always do. He looked at me keenly. I cleared my throat. It spooked me. I don't think he meant to frighten me, just that he was so convinced in what he was saying, and that conviction of foreboding was infectious. I didn't see anyone, I said. He looked down. No, only a few of us can see her. How many times have you seen her? I asked. Just 3. Ah, I said, relieved. That first time, he said. My grandfather was drowned 2 days after. He shouldn't have drowned. He'd known those channels and those banks since he was a lad. He was brought up on them. He nodded. She took him. I shrugged. Well, you don't know. It could be a coincidence. It wasn't a coincidence. What about the second time? I was a grown man then, living here with my wife. I saw her like I saw her today, standing in the water, her face all eaten by fishes. I seen her like I seen her today, standing in the water, her face all eaten by fishes. I waited for him to tell me what death or disaster followed that sighting. He did. The Solway spirit went down. She caught fire out there, and I saw the light of the flames. I went out, but the tide was high, and I saw her burn about a quarter mile out. We called the Coast Guard. Some of them jumped off, but the water was cold and the currents fast. I sat back. Even if he'd seen this drowned woman, it had only been twice. Even if he had seen this drowned woman, it had only been twice before today, and the deaths that followed were surely coincidences, whatever he thought. This third time meant nothing, certainly not for me. After all, I was a stranger here. The more likely explanation was that George Twentyman was a lonely old man who spent his time on this lonely farm or on that empty beach, grieving for his lost wife and his lost mother and father. Such a solitary fate would turn anyone's mind and get them believing in old tales. Thanks for the tea, George, I said, and the ginger snaps. I stood. He stood too. Will you come back? He said. To Pent me. I smiled. Of course I will, but not tomorrow. I have to do some shopping. He nodded and saw me to the door. As I walked over the narrow road to the path over the dunes that would take me back to Allenby, I turned round to see him standing at his door watching me. He raised a hand to wave goodbye, and I waved back. The next day, I went shopping in Workington. On a whim, I went into the public library where they had back copies of the local paper, the West Cumberland Times and Star. The librarian, Mr. Jones, who was Welsh by his accent, was very helpful. He found the record of the burning of the Solway Spirit, so that had really happened. As for the other incident, there was no trace of the death of George Twentyman's grandfather, But then I didn't know when it had been or what the man's name was. There was certainly no tale of the drowned woman in black, even in the local legends column from the 1970s. The next day, I went looking for George on the beach, intent on finishing my sketch, but he wasn't there. Way off to the south, a couple was walking, but nothing much else but birds. The sky was grey, not raining, but promising that mist comes in when the land is warm and the sea cool. So far, the threads of mist hung offshore, while the tide ebbed away, dragged by the unseen moon. But it would turn soon and come flooding back. No George, though. I was disappointed. I thought of going home, but then turned, and to my right, I saw his farmhouse at the point. I stood now halfway between sea and shore. I could have turned back, but I went looking for George. I went up to his dismal front door and at first knocked tentatively. Then, figuring I hadn't knocked hard enough, after a minute I knocked again, but there was still no reply. I paused, shrugged and turned, and then I heard a radio playing inside, some middle-of-the-road music that might come from a local radio station. So there was someone at home. The windows were shuttered up. So he must be sitting in the gloom. I rapped on the pane. "George," he said. "I'm not ready." His voice sounded half strangled. Not ready for what? But what was he not ready for? "It's Vicky," I said, "the painter." "Oh, Vicky," he said. I'm so glad you're here." I didn't know what to say, but I heard movement and then noise at the door. I went back and saw he had it open a crack, but the door was on a chain. He stared at me. He had black rings under his eyes. His hair was wild, his mouth half open. "Vicky," he said. He undid the chain with trembling hands and shoved the door open. I was astounded at the change in him. Come in. I'm so glad you're safe." "Safe? Why wouldn't I be safe? I mean, Workington can be a bit rough, but even so..." My joke fell flat. He rechained the door, bolted it, and turned the big brass key in the lock. Only then did he seem to calm down. "I didn't want her to come in," he said. "Who?" "The woman." I realized instantly he meant the so-called drowned woman whose appearance warned of her death. I studied his face. "Can I have a cup of tea, George?" He said. "Tea? I'll make the tea. You go through." I ushered him back into his house and followed him to the front room. It was shuttered up, and he had one electric lamp on. His threadbare armchair had an old blanket scrunched upon it, so it looked like he'd been there all night, not going to bed. I went to the kitchen. The kettle was on the stove, which I lit with a match. I found a teapot, milk, and biscuits. When I went to the living room, George sat, head in hands, his eyes closed. He didn't speak till after his first gulp of scalding tea. "She was outside the house last night. The tide was full in. It comes over the road, so I thought maybe she could come into the house, but she didn't. I'm so glad you're all right, Vicky." I tilted my head. "Why are you so worried about me?" He sighed heavily. "Well, I first saw you the day I saw her. I thought your coming was connected and that she was showing..." The hand that gripped the mug trembled. I leaned forward and put my hand on his arm. "George, I had an anxiety problem once, but I beat it. I know when it comes it feels overwhelming and your mind plays tricks on you. I used to check all the plugs and doors and windows even though I knew they were safe, but I'd get overcome with the idea that there would be a fire. So I know what it's like." He shook his head. "She's not in my mind, Vicky. I need you to listen to me and leave. Go back south where you're from. Preston, somewhere away from here." It was my turn to sigh. "So you think you saw her again?" "I saw her in the waves. She was just outside the house." "But you had the shutters drawn, and it was dark," he stammered. "I saw her." There was no point annoying him, so I tried a different tack. "You know, George, with a fear like this, you have to face it. That's the only way you overcome it. Otherwise, it becomes your boss and stops you doing things. This is not a fear. You look pretty scared to me." He exhaled and covered his eyes with his left hand. I know her. I know what she wants. I know you say she was outside the house. She was. I raised a placating hand. But she's mainly associated with the beach. He nodded without meeting my gaze. So I think we should go on the beach. This time. He did look up, but shook his head rapidly. No, we mustn't. You mustn't. You need to leave. George, I'm not frightened. I'll go to the beach with you. You'll see there's nothing to fear, and then you'll feel better. It's you I'm worried about, not me. But I've never seen her, so I'm not worried. Honest. I drained my tea. Come on, no time like the present. Can I leave my camera and sketch pad here? He grunted and I put them down. I got up, but he didn't. Come on, it's for the best. No, he said. Please, George. For me. Just humour me. I'll hold your hand if you want. I regretted saying that instantly. I'd meant it as a joke, but he might take it as me belittling him. In the event, he didn't even register it. I reached out. Come on. He took my hand and rose. I opened the shutter, and we'd better have some light in here. The sun shone behind the house. It wasn't yet noon. The tide was further out now. The beach was huge. There's a sea fret, he said. I raised an eyebrow. A mist off the sea. It'll roll over the sand. We'll be quick. Anyway, you know your way. The tide's coming in. He was just finding excuses. I knew what it was like. I'd done the same when I had to face up to my anxieties. Nobody wants to do it, but it has to be done. We crunched our way over the pebbles and shillies down onto the sand, past the tide lines of seaweed sticks and plastic bottles that marked each in-breath and out-breath of this cold northern sea. Then we came to the first channels of water and picked our way over the weedy stones until we arrived at an expanse of sand. We shouldn't be going out now, he said. We'll be quick. Where do you see her most? At the wave's edge, he gestured. The mist was gathering. I couldn't see the water because of it, but I knew where it was. He turned to me. You don't believe I see her, do you? I shook my head. If you saw her, would you leave? I gave a dry laugh. Instantly, believe me, but what? I won't. He nodded. Then the only way to save you is for you to see her for yourself. Come on. He strode briskly out to sea. The sand was damp and we got to another patch of rocks covered in black mussel shells. He knew his way and picked the driest path. He went on so quickly, I struggled to keep up, and at one point he became a misty shadow half lost in the gathering sea fog. I yelled, George, wait up! He stopped and turned, puzzled. He'd been lost in his mission and hadn't noticed me falling behind. He waited. I caught him up and he turned and hurried further out. The sea went out miles here. I was glad he was there because the billowing walls of mist made everywhere look the same. The sun was lost behind clouds and it was hard to tell which way was which, so I followed on behind him. How far now? I asked. Still away. Incredible how far the water goes out, nearly all the way to Scotland. Autumn tides, see? Then he went quiet. I heard his footsteps and his breathing, and he was much faster than me despite his age. I hurried to keep his dark form in sight. The fog was thicker way out here. Then we came to an area where the sea was already running back in. Careful, he yelled back. He stopped and I caught up, panting slightly. He said the sea only uncovers these sands here a few times a year, and there's some patches of mud. I looked down at my feet. He was right. So be careful where you place your feet. Just walk where I walk. What? I said alarmed. You mean it's quicksand? Yes, but you'll be safe. Just walk where I walk. We went on. I heard the waves before I saw them. It was as if I was lost in the clouds with the sloshing sea on all sides. It was really flooding back now. Is this safe? I said to George's back. No, we can't linger here, but you must see her. If you see her, you'll believe, and if you believe, then you will go away. My heart beat fast, and I was afraid. But I was the one who insisted he face his fears. The irony was that I wasn't facing mine very well. She's not here. She's not here, I said. Let's go back. He put up a hand. Wait. We're not going to see her, George. She doesn't exist. That's what you think. Listen. So I listened. I heard the waves and the gulls, but nothing else. What? Can't you hear? No. But as I listened hard, I heard. I heard the sound of someone in the water, someone walking through the waves, someone wading through the waves. She's there. Come on. Even amidst all the water, my mouth was dry. I had heard someone thrashing through the waves. There had to be a rational explanation. It would be another fisherman. But still, I trembled. Come on! And George dashed off into the fog. I saw him fade and wanted to run after him, but I was in a state. I hesitated. I called out, George, wait! But I couldn't see him anymore. The mist boiled around me, cold and vaporous. The waves were near. The tide flooded in, slowly, slowly, just above my toes now. I looked round, eyes wide. Where had George gone? George! I heard his voice calling, Come to me! But I didn't know where he was. The mist baffled the sound. I couldn't work out what direction anything was. I plunged into the fog, running now, my boots slopping through the water, and then I came to a channel where within seconds it was knee-deep. Terror gripped me. The cold water soaked to my skin. Terror gripped me. I remembered what he'd said about the quicksand. I spun round, looked up to see the sun. The sun would be south and almost overhead as it was midday. I needed to go east, but the light was refracted through the fog, and I saw no bright disk that would guide me in the mist, and so I turned and stumbled into the waves again. I cried out, George, where are you? Again he called in reply. He seemed near, but here the near sounded far away, and the distant very close. The tide had come in quicker than I thought. There was water everywhere. I splashed forward and came to a sandbank. At least it was dry here, but which way was safety? I would try to find which way was east and head in that direction. That way I would hit the beach. Even if the sea had come round behind me, it couldn't be too deep yet. I would wade if I had to. I could wade through water up to my chest. Even if there were currents, they couldn't be strong enough to carry me away. Surely they couldn't. Then I remembered the prevailing wind was from the southwest. That meant I could work out which way was east. I licked my finger and held it up, but it dried on all sides equally. There was no wind today, not even a breeze to blow the mist away. George, I yelled, I can't find you, so I'm going back to the beach. This time, he didn't reply. I turned and walked. There was water everywhere. The tide was sheeting over the sand. I would have to wade long before I got to the shingle. Just because there was water in front didn't mean I was going out to sea. The channels cut round behind. He'd said that. I needed to go into the water to get out of the water. The seawater got deeper. I kept my nerve and kept on going. The swell overtopped my rubber boots and filled them. That made it like I was walking with weights on my feet, so I bent down and wrenched the boots off, sobbing. I hurled the boots away, heard them splash out of sight and overbalanced. I landed on my back and, spluttering in panic, jumped up again. My black clothes were blacker still now, drenched with seawater and clinging to my body. I stood and ran, plunging through the waves until they were too deep. And it was like pushing through a wall. I was shivering and crying, sodden black clothes hanging on me, my dark hair running with seawater plastered to my face. I had a vision of a woman wearing soaked black clothes, with a face eaten away by the fishes. I heard a woman in panic thrashing about in the waves, trying to save herself. She was only 100 yards from dry land, but 100 yards too far. Ghosts are from the past. But it seems, ghosts are from the future too. Even before I was born, George had seen me.